want to welcome those of you who've joined us for this follow-up webinar to the one that Roy and I ran back in, I think it was April, where we're introducing what psychological safety is all about. There are some new faces today. There's some that joined us last time. There are quite a number of people who have emailed me to say they couldn't make it today, and because of other commitments, they would like to have the recording. So hence recording this so that they can share it. And also, we will make sure that we, if you're connected with us on LinkedIn, we'll tag you so you can then share it with people who you think it might be helpful for. But we want this session to be having a great conversation around psychological safety. I'm delighted to be running this again with the fantastic Roy Magara of Magara Law, who's very passionate about getting people right, getting workplaces right so that people can be their best. And that's my mantra as well. And today we are joined by Alice Lundsten, who's in the fabulous yellow. So give us a wave, Alice, everyone knows who can see you. Who's acting head of demand and capacity programme. And Leigh Forsyth, who is acting senior improvement manager in the emergency care improvement. They're both at NHS England and NHS Improvement. And they're going to be sharing their stories, their experience of working with teams to create psychological safety. And Roy and I talked about it last time I talked about it from a theoretical perspective in terms of what we need to be looking for and why it's important. Roy brought it to life with lots of case studies. But we're actually going to hear from two people who, having done a little bit of work with them, I think they're truly inspirational in terms of how they've approached it. There is no right or wrong way of doing psychological safety. That's the really important thing to say. So there are principles, there are practices that we know if we engage with those, it makes a really positive difference. We know there are things definitely not to do, but it's a continuous journey. It's something that evolves. It's something that we need to be having conscious conversations with our teams to say, what do we want this to feel like? What do we want the work experience to be like in terms of how we engage with our work and how we feel about ourselves at work and how we feel about our connection with each other at work. So when we are conscious about how we shape that makes all the difference. And I think it's something that as a team, people have to be mindful of being on that journey together. So there's never it's not one of those tick box exercises that is like, right, I've now achieved it, done it. It's something that will continually change and evolve, and people will try things out and things will work where they won't work. That's the point of today, is that you can come along and say, I've tried this, it didn't really work, or I've tried this and it was brilliant, so share it, or I'm thinking about, or I'm feeling stuck. And it's about continue to have those conversations within your team, but also with other people who can share their experience. And the reason this is really important, because we know that psychological safety goes hand in hand with workplace culture. And I was talking about workplace earlier on, saying actually it should be more work activity, because so many of us are working remotely, and I've heard people say, well, in that case, we can't have a sense of culture because we're all working remotely. Well, we still have to achieve that sense of psychological safety, even when we're working in different locations. And we know that when we get the psychological safety right, it really impacts on people's well-being. It impacts on their ability to engage with their work, their energy, their motivation, their commitment. Those of you, we were just having a chat before we started this about Brew Dog. I don't know if any of you are aware of the Brew Dog Scandal recently. There's a few nods. And that says everything about workplace culture. And actually, it's not something that you can kind of keep hidden anymore. So if you are getting it right, people hear about it. People talk about companies where they love working and they have a great experience, they're treated well, and they're given great opportunities. People will just talk about that. And people are now talking quite openly because of social media about things that are not right. So for those of you who don't know about the Brew Dog Scandal, there's a very scathing open letter that was doing the rounds, and all heavily criticizing the leadership and the culture within Brew Dog, signed by lots of people. And of course that has a real impact on, and people cited this, it has a real impact on their mental health and well-being, on their engagement. Lots of people left the workplace because they couldn't stand working there. You wonder what the implication is going to be for people currently working there. What's the implication for future recruitment? Not to mention the sales of their products and so on. So it has a really big impact. And I think when people say we don't have to worry about psychological safety because that's kind of that stuff over there, or we just need to focus on our product or on our processes or whatever it is, they're missing the point, because everything has to fit within that culture. So that's what we're going to be looking at a little bit today. Roy, do you want to say a little bit before we hand over to Alice and Leigh?
Thank you very much, Lisa. Certainly echo everything you just said. In my capacity as an employment solicitor, one of the things that we were discussing before everyone else joined into the room was about how this sort of aspect of psychological safety, or I suppose more the kind of darker side, where I have clients who come in from a spout of bullying or discrimination or some kind of issue in the workplace, and more often than not, they're at the point where they're on antidepressants or in need of counselling or in need of some kind of mental care, psychological care, because the culture's not right or certain issues aren't right in the workplace that make it toxic. And one thing that I was saying is that it doesn't make me desensitized to it. It's just so unfortunate that it's so common. And that's why conversations like this, and all being well, this is going to be a really fantastic conversation with all of you, are really important, because, and this is one of the last points I touched on in Lisa, the webinar that we did on this topic a couple of months ago, is value. And it's about understanding that who did what about every work activities culture is that universal need that everyone wants to feel uniquely respected, uniquely supported, have an understanding of their own competence and social status. And no matter what background or gender or what have you of the individual, everyone wants to feel uniquely valued. And that's what workplaces, that's what businesses need to get right. It's about having that discussion that everyone can change their mindsets of thinking, this person, this employee has got beliefs, perspectives, opinions, they've got hopes, anxieties, they've got fears, they've got a family, they're just like me. And I think if we can all get into that mindset of treating others as we'd like to be treated ourselves and treating them in the way that they deserve, how much more can we all improve in that sense? And hopefully there'll be less letters like the one concerning Brewdog, because the reality is, for one open letter like that, there are thousands of cases that go on behind the scenes that no one thinks about. And I'm not looking to do myself out of a job, because it's more important for people to be gotten right, as it were. So that's what I'll say, at least for this section. And Lisa, I'll kindly hand over back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So today's really having an opportunity to have some space to reflect on this for yourself. And one thing I would say is about consciously reflecting regularly about this with your teams. So I think as leaders and managers, people can tend to try and resolve things or try and plan things for their team. And I think actually when I've seen people take this into their company and do it really well, this is the sort of thing that have psychological safety, or whatever you want to call it, on the agenda at every team meeting. So you're checking that actually what are people experiencing that's supporting that culture that you have, as a group, we have chosen, we have shaped, we've been very explicit about what we want, how are we holding each other accountable to it, and just keeping it live, because we don't want this to be almost, another initiative. There's this whole thing about mental health, and everyone's getting a bit bored of the kind of mental health thing, and it's like, well, let's move on to psychological safety. That's almost a new buzzword. And you kind of, I was asked to do some talk about empowerment, as people saying, I think we all hear about empowerment. Let's do a bit on empowerment. Like, actually, they all overlap, and we just need to get them past them being a buzzword or a kind of a thing of the moment, and actually just become part of our day-to-day practice. But that means we need to keep it live and keep revisiting it every week with the people who it affects and who are involved. So, Alice, shall I hand over to you, and you can just share your experience, why this is important to you? I'm going to let you just talk about whatever comes to mind.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me. It's really, I'm I'm really passionate about psychological safety. This is why Lisa asked me to do it. And it's just great to be able to talk about something that you care about and that you put a lot of your energy into. So I think it's interesting around the kind of doing psychological safety. I think if anybody said that we were going to do safety in the office and then stop doing it, there'd be a horrified uproar. The idea that you can only do safety for like 2 or 3 months a year and the rest of the time it's fine if people slip over and bang their heads, it'd just be bizarre. Like, no one would ever say that that was a reasonable thing to do. And yet there's this idea that with mental health or psychological safety that you can do it for a month or for 3 weeks, or, you know, have a session and then suddenly it's not relevant anymore. And I find it really bizarre, but people don't think of it like that. They don't think of it as being the same as physical safety, and they put it into this kind of otherness or this other box. So as Lisa said, I'm the acting head of the demand and capacity team at the moment. So I've been a member of the team for a long time, and my normal boss has been redeployed to support vaccine work, so I'm covering while she's away. And I'd like to say that a lot of the psychological safety in the team really does predate me being the head of it. I think it's very much around thinking of ourselves as a team. And I think my psychological safety is as important as the others in the team. And I think that is part of what filters down into the culture that we have. It's not about being this like strong professional person who doesn't need to look after themselves as well. If you put that forward, people then think that they need to emulate it. So for instance, I'm going on leave next week and I'm off tomorrow as well. And I'm going to not be checking my emails, and I'm not going to be checking in on what's happening. And people know they can contact me if there is something really, really urgent. But in the 5 years I've been working in this team, I think I've been contacted out of hours once, and it was genuinely appropriate and it was fine. And there is something about having those different norms. So a little bit of a rambling, but I just wanted to look a little bit at what I think psychological safety is, why I think it's important, and probably as much as anything, what are the signs that I pick up on that I feel things are working and things aren't working. So in terms of the why, it's important that people are safe and feel safe so that they can focus on their jobs and not looking after themselves. I think that there's a really toxic narrative in a lot of places and in a lot of mainstream culture that you have to do long hours and you have to be seen doing long hours to be considered professional and high achieving, etc., etc. But actually, if you're worrying about how you look to others and you're worrying about what others are perceiving of your work practices, you're not putting as much energy into your work. And I think one of the key things for me leading a team is I'm there to remove as many distractions and barriers as possible so that my team can actually get on with what they're doing. We're a relatively small team. People are really passionate about what they do. And if you take away those distractions, they will just focus on the goal. They'll focus on why they're here. They'll focus on why they originally signed up for doing the job. But if you're there worrying that someone's going to be criticizing you or claiming your work as their own or bullying you, any of those things, anyone who's ever been in one of those places, if you think back to the work you were doing at that time, it will definitely not be your finest work. And when you think about the projects and the work that you're most proud of and that you really feel like you excelled, I'd put money on the fact that for most people, it was when that stuff wasn't as prevalent and that stuff wasn't really in their minds. Its absence is what makes you perform well. So there's a whole load of stuff. So we all know we need to take breaks, we need to be honest with each other, we need to be able to share how we're doing. But what does that look like? How do you do it? What does that mean on a day-to-day basis? So in our team, we have a check-in every morning. And for me, it's really, really important that it's genuinely optional. So if you want to see people's faces and you want to be able to talk about how your garden's doing or the more kind of fundamental stuff like your dad's unwell or going into hospital, then you know that there'll always be a friendly face there. If you don't want to see anyone, you genuinely don't have to. And for me, this is one of those examples of I use that as a litmus test for whether there is actually psychological safety. So people do opt out. They don't feel like they're browbeaten into going. So there will sometimes just be two of us, and that's absolutely fine. But people also do feel safe to say, look, I found out last night that my dad's going to have heart surgery, and it's a lot more urgent than we thought. And people share those things because they feel they can. Whereas by comparison, my husband has a twice weekly check-in, and if you don't attend, your line manager will contact you and ask you why. And it's that sort of thing where the intentions are good. They're trying to do psychological safety. They've been told that check-ins are a good idea, and it's a good idea that people go. But actually being scrutinized for not going means that my husband goes every time and switches his camera off and puts himself on mute, because that way he doesn't have to share if he doesn't want to, but he also doesn't get grilled by his manager for why he hasn't turned up. And another thing that I've tried to really get into my team as a way of working is, particularly when we're working from home, if you find yourself staring at your laptop blankly, go and do something else. Like literally, seriously, do your laundry, water your plants, go and play with your puppy. I don't care, because when you're blankly looking at your laptop, you are not achieving anything productivity wise for me or for the team or for the greater good of the NHS. Like, no one's winning there, but you're also not recuperating. So you're not getting a rest, but you're also not actually achieving anything. And I've said it to lots of people in team meetings, and I've also said it to them one-to-one. And for me, the point that I felt like, okay, this is working, is when I said to someone, I was like, look, really, truly, do take a break. And I was like, I know people don't always feel comfortable, but absolutely. And he interrupted me and he said, Alice, no, I know you're right. And in other teams, I wouldn't have felt like I could do that. Like, people have said that and they haven't meant it. But no, I know you do mean it. And I have been doing that, and I have been going for a walk when I can't focus. And for me, that was when I felt like, okay, yeah, we're making it happen. Because people are dedicated. They do want to do what they're interested in. And then my last bit, because I think I might have rabbited on too long and Leigh needs to have his time as well, is when it comes to psychological safety, mental well-being, there's, I think, an unhelpful narrative around the idea that there are nice managers and then there are tough managers. And it won't surprise anyone that I'm putting the nice manager bracket, which is fine, and I wouldn't want to be known as a nasty manager. But I think there's this perception that if you're a nice person that cares about people, you're also going to be a bit of a soft touch. I would say I would like to think of myself as a kind manager, not a nice manager. And actually, if there are performance issues and people aren't performing in the way that you need them to, you're not doing them a kindness if you don't tell them. And you have to do the kindness with the hard messages as well as the go and take a break messages. And if you maintain that, honestly, I think the productivity bit of it kind of takes care of itself. So that's my last bit that I want to say. And it'd be great to have conversations with people afterwards. I will stop talking in a minute and let Leigh speak, but I'd be really, really interested to just hear what people think and how does that play out in your organisation? Did any of that resonate? What does it look like where you're working? So yeah, thank you very much. And I'll hand over. I'm handing over to Lisa, and then I think Lisa will hand over to Leigh.
Alice, I loved what you shared. I think, your observations around check-ins and so on was brilliant. And I really loved the point you made about the difference between being nice and kind. I think that's a really brilliant distinction. And I think it's a very, very valid one to make. So I'd love to have a conversation about that at the end, because I think that's something that doesn't get picked up that often. So thank you for sharing. Right, Leigh, got a tough act to follow.
Yeah, and I'm going a slightly different wander, I think, is probably the best way of putting it. And I suppose the reason for that is when Lisa asked me to talk on this, I was a little bit surprised, if I'm completely honest, about, because psychological safety isn't something I'd necessarily really thought about, or really contextualized, I think, the way I'm acting and working with the team in that context. And so it got me to reflect a little bit. I was like, well, actually, how have I arrived at this place where actually someone thinks that this is worthy of sharing? I say because it almost fell off the chair when I was asked. So I spent a bit of time sort of reflecting on my journey, I suppose. And I think so. My background is I'm a physiotherapist. My background worked a lot in neurodisability and neurorehabilitation, and that's working with patients with motor neuron disease, MS, stroke, Parkinson's, a lot of conditions you can't really change or cure. And so essentially what you're trying to do with these people is actually trying to achieve what they want to achieve in their goals, understanding that actually physically we may not make a massive difference. And so when you start getting into that sort of mind space of these individuals, you can start moving people forward, and independence becomes that much more of a sort of a mindset. And so actually they move into that self-actualization and being able to do what they want to do takes on a different life. But sometimes you just need to go and work with them, almost as a Sherpa, to be honest, to get to that place. So there's no point, me going to somebody and saying, you're probably never going to walk again. Because actually all that does is that person is completely switches off. They don't listen to you, they don't engage with you, and actually you've lost any ground you've got with them straight away. And actually you don't 100% know that either. I suppose is the other bit. There are some cases where in the minority they may well walk again, and they may well completely surprise you. But the vast majority don't. But the process of going through that with an individual around that sort of working with them, gaining trust, getting that collaborative approach is so important in their actual treatment to get them to that point. So they get so tied up with self-efficacy. I don't mean that is that belief in one's capability to be able to do it. And I think in neurodisability terms, I think that's so important. And it sort of then starts moving out from realism into constructivism when you start thinking about actually there's a black and white. With some things, there is a very black and white way of doing things. Other situations, there's more of it's the person in there, it's the view of their world and getting into their world and being able to walk with them that actually you can still get the same outcome. So you may not necessarily change anything structurally, but you actually have the same outcome. They can still achieve the same things in a slightly different approach. I think so. I'm not going to go through all my jobs, you'll be pleased to know, but I'm just going to do some other key bits. So then went from being a clinician into various operational roles, but then came the bit that I really got into was quality improvement within healthcare. And what I mean by quality improvement is essentially taking a systematic approach to change. So just taking the method, tools, and trying to look at a process or a problem, actually trying to address it through that lens. There's, I don't know what businesses you're all in, but with healthcare, there's a number of different approaches, sort of lean, IHI, model for improvement. There's various different approaches and techniques. They're all branded, which with generally quite expensive models that all claim to be fantastically effective. When you start looking at all of the research and evidence around them, they're probably all as equally as effective as each other in different situations. So when you actually, and the more I worked in this particular area, the more I came to realise that actually, as much as there are tools and processes and methods, actually what this was a cultural intervention. The tools were there to almost flatten the hierarchy, to encourage discussion between the managers and the frontline staff, trying to make sure that actually a lot of the change was happening at the frontline staff and empowering people to do some of that. And actually really realising that most of these sort of branded methods and approaches were actually more of an OD type intervention. That cultural and leadership piece was more important than the actual tools and techniques themselves. And then sort of alongside that, when you work in this particular area, I was lucky enough to work with a number of different hospitals in various different projects, some really successful, some not so much. And there's this popular statistic that's thrown around in the QI world, especially in healthcare, around only 30% of projects achieve sustainable improvement. And quite a pick up on that, say, well, 70% don't succeed, so therefore why bother investing in it? Which at the time, when I first started, I was like, well, that's actually probably a really good point. Actually, if 70% do fail, then what is the point? But I think that's more our approach to failure and understanding what that failure is, and that cultural competence around failure. I was lucky enough to talk to Chris Hadfield, who's the Canadian astronaut, a few years back, and one of the things he was talking about at the time was early success is the enemy of learning, and I think this is really, really applicable to this. That actually, if you learn that, if other 70% of the time you're learning something, then actually I don't see that as a failure at all. And I think as a manager and as a leader, our reaction to that is so important. But actually, if in that the 70% of the time you're beginning to learn and understand, or actually, well, why didn't that happen? Well, what happened then, and who did this, and how did that happen? And as you start looking at the problems with curiosity rather than saying actually it's a failure, it's not black and white. It's actually, well, actually, what would make a difference? What if you did this slightly differently? What would happen then? And then you can start sort of unpicking some of that and trying to support people to go through that to try and understand, well, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Have you actually now just clearly after going through this process, have you now got a clear focus on what the problem is? Which is actually was a result quite a lot of times of going through a quality improvement process, that actually the problem wasn't very well defined at the starting place. And so that's learning, that's not failing, that's understanding. And I think some of the things just put in the comments around falling, not failing, which I think is on the Simon Sinek podcast that's sort of going around at the moment. I completely agree with everything he says around this. If someone fails, there's a real reaction to it. If someone falls, the cultural experience is more, we try and pick them up, we try and help them, we try and support them. And I think what he says around this is so important. And so I think there's then something around how I've tried to sort of bring that into my role. So my role now is some improvement advice, provide improvement advice and support for hospitals, especially around accident emergencies and flow through the hospital. So it's a fairly, as you can imagine, over the last sort of 12, 18 months, we've been pretty busy, and it's been quite an important, it's quite high on a lot of people's radars. So, but we are advice and support, so people can ignore us, and that's absolutely fine. It is advice and support, and that is part of our role. And so I suppose the essence of what we try and do as a whole team is to try and make sure the advice we give is the best advice there is in any particular situation. And especially in the last 18 months, it's fairly unprecedented what we've been trying to deal with. So actually, there isn't a black and white. There isn't anybody that actually knows 100% what right and wrong is here. And I think this is where we start going into things like a complexity theory and the Sinefem model, when you start thinking about this, that actually for the simple and complicated, there probably is a right and wrong way of doing things. And actually you need your experts in there. I'm lucky enough to have a team of experts, but with diverse views on things. So we also then working into the world of complexity. And what I mean by complexity is there isn't necessarily a right or wrong. It's a bit like going back to the astronaut analogy. Sending a space shuttle into space is complicated, as in you need a team of experts. But actually, once you've done it once, there's a reasonable chance you're going to get it right the next time. There is a right and wrong way of doing it. It's very, very complicated, but there is a right and wrong way of doing it. I think complex is more like raising a child. I've got 2 children. My first child was absolutely delightful. The second one, that feels like he's been raised by wolves. So there's something around that complexity. You can do exactly the same thing the second time, and then not necessarily have the same outcome. And I think when you start getting into that world of complexity, it starts getting more about trying to get agreement and certainty around what's going to happen next. And the only way you can do that is to talk and to have those conversations and try and walk through those discussions. And I suppose so what we've tried to do on our team is, I suppose, foster a bit of a culture that none of us are as clever as all of us. So actually, if we have all of us inputting into a problem, we're probably going to come up with a much better solution than we are by an individual. So we quite often work in a way that an individual start the thinking off, put the straw man together, then as a team we'll come together and try and pick it apart, and almost really try and there's a concept called bulletproofing that we use in QI, but we try and do that, I suppose, within our team a little bit. And that quite often fosters disagreement, discussion, I think it's fair to say sometimes anger. But it's the way the team manages that and sort of try to process that, because it's all coming, most of us are trying to get exactly the same outcome. So it's actually how we create the space in our team to have those discussions, and actually how we must built that platform of trust in the first place. So that you get to those discussions when you trust each other. And so we try and have a lot of time, as I was saying about the check-ins, and they're genuine check-ins that actually what's going on in your life at the moment. And then if people turn up, they turn up. If they don't, it's absolutely fine. I think there's something around just the other ways we try and work within our team. I'm well aware, and I'm sure it's the same within where you work. Work doesn't come in on a 9-to-5 basis. It comes in really ad hoc. We quite often get unrealistic turnaround times. and it happens far too frequently. But that's the life, and that's the world we're in. And so we generally try and give that sort of flexibility and trust to people, that actually we've got projects and processes we need to deliver. We also have lives. We need to work in a way that suits us. And I think the last 18 months working from home in this way has really helped that and helped foster that, because actually if you have that underlying trust, you can just say, so we need to get this done by Friday. Who can do this? How can we get it done? And so people often work quite late into the evening, but then we'll just don't work the next day. That's fine. One of us can cover one of us can cover it and pick it up. And I think trying to have that flexibility and trust, and really not trying to check in, not trying to work in a 9 to 5 way. Because my experience is most people will work the hours you give them and some. And the more you trust them, the more they tend to give, and the more they want to work with you. And I think by co-designing things, trying to have the whole team coalesce around the problem. I think it's Myron's maxim was people own what they create. And so I think the more you can get people involved and working together as a team, they tend to own it. So actually they want to see it through. I suppose the other things we've tried to do on a practical level with this is, for me, coming into this as a new manager, I think one of the things I said to Lisa to begin with is when I had some interviews with a few weeks ago, was I've come straight to the team and said, I am pretty new to this. I'm lucky enough to have a really, really experienced team around me. So I just said to them, if you think I'm about to walk off a cliff, tell me. I'm not proud enough or not stupid enough to think I have all the answers yet. So just tell me. It's much easier you tell me, we have a discussion, than it is that we pick up the pieces 2 or 3 weeks later when I've done something really stupid and all of you completely disagree with me. So I would just try to foster that culture of challenge within the team. And I think I suppose the other bit I haven't really touched on, as I said, I've got a team of experts, but as humans, we're all better at some things than others. And I think what we try to take the approach is that real strength based, even within the teams. Again, we want to do that with the teams we're working with. Some of us are much better than others at things. Some of us are absolutely useless at, say, time management or organisation. We just don't give them the tasks that what they requires. They're good at other things. That's absolutely fine. Let's just give them more of that and less of the stuff we know they're not particularly good at. But we're also quite honest about what we're not very good at. And I think again it comes from that sort of place of trust. I think the last bit I'll sort of touch on is, I suppose, and I think it probably comes to do with, I think this is probably fairly unique to the way we work and the type of role I'm in. But one of our previous directors basically said, our role isn't to run in and do and provide almost a rescue mission into the hospitals. Our role is to basically go, look, understand, and then to stand back and think. I don't actually, we have time to stand back and think, because actually that thinking, that discussion point is so important for the work we actually do. These are our peers in the hospital we're working with. These are our peers that they're working with. So I think that's sort of the flavour we're trying to do, trying to completely flatten that hierarchy of, we do have the easier job in this. And so let's try and respect that time, respect other people's time and each other's time in all of this. I think that's also one of the sort of key things, is just being respectful of each other. And that's probably I think one of the key ingredients for us. It's just trying that respect for each other and our colleagues.
Wow, you shared loads, Leigh. Considering you were like, I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about. Like, why inviting me? I could have carried on listening for another half an hour.
But I said I just don't. There's a lot of reflection in the last couple of weeks, Lisa. Because I wasn't quite. I felt a bit of a fraud.
I think, but that in itself raises a really important point about some people are naturally find this sort of thing easier. They're naturally more inclined to think about people first and prioritize being kind and prioritize people feeling safe to have a voice and so on. And other people find that more of a challenge and have to consciously, develop their skills and their awareness of how to do that. And I think that's a really good example of, Leigh, you're doing so much of this already, and you had termed it psychological safety. And it's only when I kind of gave it that container, if you like, you're like, actually, yeah, that does tick a lot of those boxes. But you live and breathe it, and some of the points you were bringing, about the respect and about the trust, about the fact that all of you together are so much more impactful than just each person being on their own. You know, you're obviously living and breathing this. That's why your team's going to really benefit from having you leading them.
Thank you.
So, Roy, did you want to say anything before we kind of just open it up?
No, thank you. In fact, I've been making a number of notes to ask specific people in the group. So nothing to kind of expand on in that sense, but I've got sort of questions to ask others depending on what their roles are.
Perfect.
If you're happy to, I might throw out a question for discussion, if that's okay, Lisa.
Yeah, do.
Great, thank you. So let's see. Andrew Rose. So Leigh touched on something about beliefs in one's capability to do something regarding serious injuries, etc. And I know from my own understanding of you and what you do as a director in a kind of similar space, as it were, directly or indirectly, with serious injuries, trauma, etc. In your role, what your thoughts are on that in terms of one's belief in capability to do something, and how that might reflect for you on this topic?
Yeah, so I work at a brain and complex injury case management company. So yeah, we support people with complex needs in the community or in any setting. And I suppose the easiest way of describing what our case managers do is almost like a project manager for all aspects of an individual's life. So support, therapy, accommodation, anything. And we also employ support workers as well. So for me, the importance is it's about trust, it's about valuing, it's about empowering people. So I've done a lot of work in motivational interviewing over the years, which is kind of a therapeutic approach about coming alongside people and the importance of avoiding conflict with people, which just makes utter sense in terms of why would you try and do anything else. But traditionally, the medical model actually does promote kind of conflict by you go along with, you have a problem, you go and see an expert who tells you what to do. And now, funnily enough, what we all tend to do is go, I'm not doing that. You walk away and you come back to your next session and you go, have you done that? No, because you didn't ask me how I could do that in my life. So it's the importance of engaging with that, and the importance in certainly for me is about the value of support workers. My view has always been that the support workers are actually the ones that do the important job, because they're the ones that work with our clients all of the time. You can have a fantastic therapist who can walk in for an hour and give some great advice, but unless your support workers feel like they feel empowered and they feel valued, then it's not going to happen, because they're the ones that are actually delivering to the clients and supporting them. So yeah, it's about valuing everybody and having, I guess, that confidence in yourself if you're in a kind of a senior role, to say, do you know what, actually this system should be turned on its head, because what you do is far more important than what I do. I'm there to kind of support you, but actually you're the ones that are delivering to clients. So yeah, all those things resonate hugely with me, and things that are really, really important, and trust and transparency and openness and the aspect of psychological safety. I think I was going to say the same as Leigh, in a way of going, I think I actually do lots of these things. I'd never encapsulated it as psychological safety. When you kind of first saw the term, I was going, yeah, of course that's why people will be honest. Of course that's why people will say, oh, I've made a mistake in work. I remember years ago, I was working in Australia and we had a support worker, and we were working with clients with extreme challenging behaviour, and this lady started, and we were having no incident reports whatsoever from her. And I had chatted to her and I said, can I just have a chat, because I'm really worried because we're not getting any incident reports from you. And she burst into tears. And I was like, well, heck, pulls back. And she disclosed that in her last place of work, if they put in an incident report, they would get hauled in by the line manager going, what's going wrong? And I was going, whoa, if we don't get instant reports, we're not learning what's going on, because there are things, these clients do not have instants. They have 30, 40, 50, 60 instants a day. We want that because that's the only way we're going to learn. And we just empowered her to be herself and to be honest and to be open. And she realized that and stayed and did a great job. And she was amazing for staying there, because, you know, she had a kind of tough time because she didn't have the confidence to be herself to begin with. But yeah, and I'll shut up now.
I think there's some really interesting reflections there, though. So especially on I think that, again, there's quite interesting parallels. I think the support work and the therapist, I couldn't agree more. That's my observations as well. And the support workers tend to listen more. They tend to understand. Because they don't have the hierarchy. I think one of the major challenges, I think, in the therapist, I think this comes into the workplace as well for most contexts, is the therapist being put into there as an expert, and so they try and behave as they feel an expert would behave, as opposed to listening as a person. And I think that flattening the hierarchy, and I think it almost comes with time with therapists. And the more experienced therapists you get, the more you realise you need to take that more psychosocial approach as opposed to the medical model. But I think it's similar in most areas. I think if you come into a role, and I can reflect on some of my own previous operational roles where I felt like I should behave in a certain way because I was a manager, as opposed to just being myself. And I think that's almost that hurdle of inexperience, I think, in the therapy context. But in my own operational life, you sort of need to get over to be able to get to the point where you listen.
Right. I think I remember an interview I had when I was employed, and one of the questions I had was, okay, well, Roy, if someone did something wrong, would you tell us so that we can carry out a disciplinary procedure? And I thought, goodness, I mean, actually, I said, no, I wouldn't. I'd just say to this person, by the way, it looked like this was wrong. What are the learning points? And that's that. And I think Dave Hickman, you put in the chat about having sort of transparency is key and a no blame environment. Did you have a kind of background story to that, or anything you wanted to expand on?
Hi, Roy, thanks. I worked in operations management for 17 years, and I did find myself being the buffer between my valued employees, people that I'd personally hired, people that I'd inherited through TUPE transfers. I was the buffer between these individuals and my bosses. So in terms of having a blameless environment, it always gave the best results. And I would say that sometimes if people aren't that aware of what they're doing, if they have their finance cap on, if they're concerned about budgets, they will not have people's well-being on their agenda. They're just looking to cut costs, because what we don't see is that sometimes their roles are on the line and that they're under immense pressure to affect these savings. So in terms of having transparency, it's great for the front line, and it's great to actually be on site. It's very difficult. I had 12 geographical locations, and being on site enough was always a struggle because I needed to be in the office as well, and we can't be in two places at any one time. So I would say that in terms of transparency, yeah, that works. In terms of being able to communicate upwards as well as downwards, that's a real skill if you're in operations management. And I think one of Leigh's comments about leading the team want to like you. They want to get along with you, and they want you to do well. And a return process is the fact that you want to get the best out of your team, and that you will perform if your team performs. If your team doesn't perform, then the reciprocal effect is that you fall even further, and it's even harder to pick ourselves up. And I do like the Simon Sinek analogy. It's very user friendly, especially when you're discussing this with school children and people who are entering further education. I work with the University of Portsmouth, currently doing work with them now, and it's interesting to see that their brains are still growing. that's not a detrimental thing to say, but they see the world differently, and that it can be very black and white or very confused. And with this open line of communication, it's then easier to understand what their challenges are. Maybe other people in the group have had experience of this.
Anybody else want to kind of comment on that, or comment on anything that Alice was also raising? I know, Alice, you're inviting end of your slot sort of for a bit of conversation. I don't know if anything for you that you'd particularly like to get some feedback on.
Nothing in particular. I remember seeing lots of nodding heads at various points, and I always think it's lovely to have that feedback. Thank you for people who put their cameras on. It really is much easier to talk to faces than it is to a screen. But I just wondered if there was anything that people like it triggered, or that I don't know, experiences that you've had in your workplaces.
I've certainly had, places where they're saying that they're doing kind of not psychological safety, but we care about you, and then the behaviour is completely the opposite. And yeah, I definitely smiled at your husband's experience of let's have check-ins, and if you don't turn up, we'll ring you up to go, why haven't you turned? It's just like, what is the point in that? Makes no sense whatsoever to me, but there we go.
I think there's a lot of that happening in organisations at the moment, compulsory check-ins. It's bizarre. Alistair, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Just to link to what Dave just said, I learned something recently from the neuroscience people. They were saying that because you're a leader, your people are just scared of you. They call it a threat response. It triggers a threat response in the brain. So then people don't challenge you if you are the leader coming up with something. So I think for leaders, just being aware of that your presence alone is a threat. So then no matter what you suggest in that meeting, no one will challenge because you're a leader. So that's something that comes up for me from what Dave said, saying that your team wants you to succeed, but then you might not be approachable. I mean, I've worked in businesses where they say, oh, open door policy, but it's not really open. The door's not really open. And for me personally, and why I'm on the call right now, and maybe it's a discussion for another day. So I'm based in South Africa. I just bumped into this link on LinkedIn. Thank you for that. So I moved from finance into the diversity and inclusion space. So it's a nice word to say racism work, actually. And like, I've just come out of a meeting with a client, a potential client. I just couldn't get that psychological safety, even from my side, to tell him what I'm selling to his business. So can we at some point talk about how do we create psychological safety around, say, issues around race? Because in my opinion, these are like issues that are sort of underlying, but they never come out in the workplace, just like sexual harassment stuff, right? Then you get a Harvey Weinstein who's like operating in that industry for decades, but people are not really talking about it in the workplace. So you get consultants who come in with questionnaires and culture surveys, and they don't dig deeper into these issues. And even if they do dig deep into them, there isn't psychological safety to say we've got a sexual harassment issue in this business, or we've got a race issue in this business. And I'm also struggling with that to even market my product to someone. The moment I say, oh, I sell stuff around racism, and they're like, whoa, we don't want to touch that topic. Then, then people don't really move forward.
Yeah, really good points there, Alistair. And I think just touching on that last one about race, interestingly, I read a case yesterday of this individual who was dismissed from his work for this was his work for using the N-word, so-called, but he was using an example about something, and he sort of quoted someone else, and he was asking a question in a group forum, and he was dismissed. And very long story short, he went to a tribunal hearing, and it was found that he was unfairly dismissed. And there are plenty of reasons why, and in actually many respects, I agree with the tribunal hearing. I mean, he'd been there for 25 years, got a clean record. He was asking a genuine question, and he was quoting something, not out of ignorance or naivety or anything, but he was just actually genuinely inquiring. And it eventually transpired that there were 2 other colleagues who made an anonymous complaint. And looking at the paperwork, he was sort of heartbroken about it, and he was saying, listen, I apologize. I'm happy to apologize to these people directly. I'm really sorry, etc. And very long story short, the company just took a sort of very kind of carte blanche, hard approach, and just dismissed him without there being a discussion, a conversation. And I thought that was quite a shame in a way, because there were so many learning points that could have been had, as opposed to thinking, oh, he mentioned race, oh, it's really topical at the moment, oh, okay, you're fired, and think that's done, and they forget about him as an individual.
I think there's so much, isn't there, around just that fear of saying the wrong thing. And I've had so many conversations with companies who say, we want to be able to talk about race or gender inequality or whatever it might be, but we're terrified of saying the wrong thing or labeling something in an appropriate way, or they almost feel like they're tiptoeing along. And my advice with working with teams like that has always been, actually, it's about setting out your intentions to start with, and if you say something that is offensive, to invite, and this is where it comes back to having a psychologically safe culture, to invite people to be able to say, if you say something that's offensive, for them to be able to say, actually, I feel offended by that. And if you learn from that, you're able to apologize for a mistake. We all come from different backgrounds. We've all been brought up in different ways. At certain points, in certain times, certain language is okay. I never forget the time in our village near here at Fate, a vicar using a really, really inappropriate term to announce the winner of a competition, and everyone was like, their jaws dropped. It's like, this is a vicar, but he's a really old vicar who once upon a time it was okay to use that language. So it's about educating, but you have to have those honest conversations, and that means about being held accountable, but being able to speak up, and when someone else does or says something that doesn't fit the culture, to be able to say in an appropriate way, that makes me feel uncomfortable because, and until we get to that, as you say, Alistair, people will avoid those conversations. It's like, I don't want to speak about this because I might say the wrong thing.
I think
there also needs to be, sorry, go for it.
I know one of the things we're trying to do in our organisation at the moment is, I think, he's trying to open the discussions around race, around just diversity. And I think the key learning points for us is around, I suppose, recognition around the whole problem. And so what I mean by that is around just understanding the whole concept of privilege. And just because if you can't understand privilege, you're only seeing part of the problem. And therefore your solutions are blinkered to support the problem as well. So I think there's something around trying to get that collective culture of and collective view of actually what the problem is we're trying to wrestle with a bit here. I think let's go back to some of the QI stuff. One of the cardinal sins of quality improvement, people launch on trying to fix something that isn't actually the problem. And if the organisation or culture you're working doesn't really understand privilege in its widest sense, then you're limited in what your options are to then tackle the next part of the conversation.
Yeah. What I was going to say is there's people feel like they're in a risk scenario when they're talking about race and sexual discrimination and abuse, and people feel very uncomfortable, and they should feel uncomfortable. But I think there's almost a perception that saying nothing is the low risk option, and I think there's something about highlighting that actually not saying anything is the high risk option, because that is when you have the Harvey Weinsteins, and that's when it goes really, really wrong. And it's about somehow, I think, shifting that focus from the risk of being the person who says something offensive is a lesser risk than the risk of being the person who let something really atrocious happen underneath their noses. And people aren't thinking of it in that way. They're thinking about the here and now and the immediacy of, oh, well, what if I say it wrong? And there's, that people are putting risk in the wrong place, in my opinion. And on the privilege bit, I think in terms of a lot of equality and diversity work, the aim isn't for people to not have unconscious bias. The aim is for people to realise that they have it. Because they do, we all do. And as soon as you try and put yourself into the place of like, oh, well, I'm not one of those people, it's like, no, you are, I am, we all are. It's about recognising that and figuring out what yours is, rather than trying to put a lot of energy into pretending you don't have it.
Well said, Alice. Yeah, good point. Thank you. I'm just aware of time. Can I just ask if anyone's got any particular questions? Thank you, Alice, for asking your question that to offer that up for discussion. Has anyone else come with particular questions that they would like to sort of throw out to Alice or Leigh or anyone else for that matter?
If not, I've got a question to throw out, just for the record.
Okay, go for it, Roy.
Thank you. I was going to ask Paul Winfield this question. So Leigh had spoken about allowing flexibility so that staff can adapt in terms of their own lives, etc. And I think my knowledge of you via LinkedIn is that as a community paramedic, I wonder how that kind of principle reflects in your day-to-day or with the staff around you.
Well, my situation is a tricky situation at the moment, and I was very much hoping you weren't going to ask me very many questions. I'll be honest with you. I was just hoping to sit and listen, but a lot of things that everybody has said today, they do. Being frontline, it's really difficult. I mean, I've been a paramedic for a long time, worked for the NHS for just over 19 years now, and it's always been a culture of don't say anything, keep your head down, don't mention, don't rock the boat. That was what it always has been. It's never been encouraged to have an environment of, to promote psychological safety. It's okay saying, oh, well, it's an open door policy. We want this challenge. We want people to challenge the norm. We want until somebody challenges the norm, and then they don't particularly want that, and yet they encourage it, and then they put barriers up. And like I say, I'm in quite a unique situation at the moment. But a lot of people, what people are saying, it's expectation versus reality, and it's what people expect, and it's really nice having these kind of spaces to discuss this kind of thing. But until it's implemented across the board, until everybody understands what it's all about, then expectation it's always going to be different to reality, and it's not cohesive. Everybody needs to know this, and it's from the ground up, and it's from the top down. And until we get that kind of culture spread throughout the different industries, well, it's always going to be the few versus the many. So I've come from a medical place with the NHS, and like I say, it has always been difficult to speak up about certain issues, even though they encourage it. Well, they don't really, because you become, I'm not going to say you become a target, but sometimes you become a target if you speak up, and nobody wants to be the target, because life is very difficult anyway, and there's extreme pressures, and nobody wants that extra burden of being the one, or you don't want to be the canary in the coal mine, do you? But that's my experience. And
there's someone who didn't want to share, Paul. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Really value that.
That's really, really valuable. And you raise a really valid point about the reality being often quite different to what we want. I think more and more people are voting with their feet now. So as people realise actually what they could experience, what they're entitled to, actually how some companies are doing things in a really good way. People are now moving around much more to follow what feels right for them. So it's no longer just notion of I got a job, I just have to put up with it. It's a sense of I'm worth more than that. And it's about kind of looking after me and finding something where I'm valued and respected and I trust people and I enjoy working. We spend a lot of hours working, and it's got to be something where we feel we fit in and we're valued. So thank you so much for sharing that. Has anyone else got any comments they want to make in response to what Paul was mentioning, or any other questions?
So just Paul, I completely relate to what you're saying. We work across numbers of organisations, and well aware this is miles from the reality for a number of organisations. There is a growing body of evidence at the moment, though, of the relationship between culture and overall hospital performance and medical outcomes. There's a whole movement called Civility Saves Lives, which is a great medical website to have a look at, and just the effects, changing the effect of toxic cultures on medical decision making. And it's just, it does cost lives. So this isn't just a nice to have. This, I think the message is beginning to seep through with the organisations.
Could you put that website in the chat, please, Leigh?
Yep.
Thank you. And I'd also say, people have to, depending where you sit in an organisation, you might not have the ability to control and very consciously shape company-wide, organisation-wide the culture, but you can certainly look at where you can make an impact. And I think certainly in companies I've worked in, the managers who really prioritise this and focus on it with their team, even if everything else going on around them is something quite different. When you're focusing on what's going on in your team, you're making a difference there. People see that, and when that speaks volumes, because people will start to notice the performance of your team or what people are saying about your team, the relationships with your customers, and that spreads. So just starting small, and although it can be hard because it might not be something you're experiencing from your seniors, you're making a difference to those people you can influence. So it's not ideal, but it's a starting point. I'm aware of time. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to share? Like also nuggets of, we've heard from Alice and we've heard from Leigh, but there are other people here who might have something to share that is something that you've been doing, which has made a real difference, and you would like just to spend a couple of minutes discussing, or any other particular questions that people wanted to ask.
Yeah, Lisa, if I can just say a couple of words. So it's interesting that, I'm in a company that does meteorological, oceanographic services in the commercial world. And I've been heading up a department, 25 people or so for a number of years. And it's been a great department with a lot of motivation in it, some great people in it. And I'm all about the people. And I know if I look after the people, then they look after the business sort of for me in many ways. And I'm now changing my role slightly. I'm taking on another load of people, and I'm having to really analyze myself in terms of what did I do in terms of looking after my whole department before that made that department so good. And it's incredibly difficult to put my finger on it. And I try and think, okay, well, what am I going to try and work on with all these new characters to make them all happy, to understand what they want, what makes them tick, and to get the best out of them by them being the best to themselves. And it's incredibly difficult, I'm finding. I listened to Alice and Leigh and our man up in the Derbyshire Dales, Andrew, I think it was. You make me homesick there. And it's so interesting. I've written down loads of notes, and I'm thinking, what's the number one? What's the number 2, 3, 4, 5 things I can pick out here that I can really tangibly work on with a big bunch of new people? Because before, it's sort of just looking after the people, caring about them, just sort of happened in the background. And it's interesting that I'm now really having to think very hard about, well, what on earth is it? What makes what are the things that I somehow am doing that motivates these people? And there's some really good things that I've written down from the talk here today. And I think one of the things fundamentally is about me, number one, listening, not directing, listening a lot, asking a lot of questions. Of course, giving people time, loads of time, to find out what matters to them, find out where little problems are, but also just continuously putting myself in their shoes and thinking, if I was sitting in their shoes with their responsibilities, with the little bits of their life that I know, what might I want? What might matter to me? And continuously trying to think from their perspective. So anyway, I'm not just giving you my life story. It's a question really to people. Does anybody have any pointers as to what I could do, what I could prioritize on? There's not a list of 20 great items and things, but sort of here's a few biggies. As a question.
Can I just say, Mike, because knowing a bit about you and how you work, and knowing that you really prioritize people, and you've run a really successful department, have you asked those people who you worked with what it is specifically that you do that they really value? So rather than you sitting there trying to work it out what you're doing right, go and ask the people that have really benefited and who have worked really well because you're leading them, and say, what is it that I've done that you really like, that works?
Yeah. Okay. It's not something I've ever asked. I almost protected myself from that question.
We don't tend to. We tend to. We never ask people what they think we're doing well, because it just doesn't feel very
No.
done thing. But it's the quickest way of finding out what it is that people really value, and also doing the sense of scaling, where 0, you've got the worst place to work, or the worst manager, or whatever it is you want to focus on, the worst team, and then a 10, you've got what it's like to be the perfect place or person. And then actually getting everyone in your new team to describe what a number 10 looks like. And then what are the specific behaviours we'd be observing at that. So we know what it is we're working towards. Because then you've almost got a checklist there to say, well, I'm really good at listening, I'm really good at this, but actually people want a bit more of that. And that's not something I'm so good at. So I need to go and explore that a bit more.
Yeah, because you can do that formally or informally. So you can do like 360 feedback. But you need a psychologically safe workplace to be able to do that, because people need to be honest. And so I think one of the big things is just modeling of behavior. So don't ask anyone to do anything that you won't do yourself first. I think is really important. And sort of in the chat, communication and active listening. So that's showing that you're giving back, that you are genuinely listening. So you're summarizing to someone, I've heard what you've said and I value what you say. But I think, Lisa's point of I remember the first time I was ever asked, kind of like, so why are you good at the job that you do? Why are you good at working with these really complex, really, really challenging clients? And I just went, I don't know. And I've just never been asked that question, never kind of thought about it. And then when I thought about it, I kind of went, I'm still struggling. Can I have some help from people? Tell me. And then people told me, and I went, yeah, no, I'd have never said any of that myself. Never would have never come up with it. But when people said it, I went, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, didn't know I did that.
Okay. So I need to
a
ask.
A few years ago, I did. I must say, this is just prompting. I'm going to do this again, actually. Thanks, Lisa. But I did just a survey monkey for myself, just an anonymous survey monkey. Name 3 things I'm doing well at, 3 things I should do less of, and just put it out for everybody anonymously. And then I owned the feedback, so I was petrified of what was going to come back, if I'm honest. But actually, it was a really rewarding experience. There was far more positives than there were negatives, and I was slightly shocked. And the negatives were things I genuinely had no idea of, so it was really useful.
Okay, I like that idea.
Can I also just share a book, a recommendation, The Ideal Team Player, which talks about the qualities of being a really good team player. And it's got a little assessment thing. I call it assessment, I hate that word, but it's got a little thing in the back that you can use to think about, you reflect on yourself, you can use it to reflect on your team, and it's about identifying what your team is like and what you're like against kind of key attributes that have been identified to make a really, really big difference to teams. So it's a really, the reason I love this book as well is it's written like a story. So you just kind of get into it and just follow the narrative, and it's fabulous, and then it pulls it together. So it's an easy read, which I like. Hope that's helpful, Mike.
Definitely is. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.